Ayn Rand is rightfully seen as a joke to most serious philosophers, in the same way that Nickelback is seen as a joke to music critics. However, while I do not blame any individual philosopher for treating Rand and her ethics with disregard, I do think that the lack of engagement with her ideas has left an unfilled hole that many more clever libertarians have exploited to their advantage. Most critiques of Ayn Rand, you'll find, do not attempt to engage with her at her moral foundations, but instead on practical grounds that do not necessarily address the main point. This is arguably sufficient for many, as Rand's ideas are morally reprehensible on a very intuitive level. But for those who have a special motivation to continue believing in her ethic, it does very little. What's more frustrating is that many videos and posts which do address her meta-ethical claims misconstrue and misrepresent her actual argument. This video, then, is an attempt to ameliorate this. I will first outline Rand's argument for objective morality, as sourced from The Objectivist Ethics, the first chapter from The Virtue of Selfishness. In this first section, I will not be critical of Rand's argument. Following this, I will give a very specific critique that I feel undermines her entire ethical project. Rand defines ethics as a code of values that guides choices. Rand's purpose is arguing a realist view of ethics, that there are moral truths regardless of what anyone may feel about it. Crucially, though, she believes that the truth maker of ethical claims is man's nature. Quote, "The concept value is not primary. It presupposes an answer to the question, of value to whom and for what. It presupposes an entity capable of acting to achieve a goal in the face of an alternative. Where no alternative exists, no goals and no values are possible. The fact that a living entity is determines what it ought to do." Unquote. What goals, then, do all organisms strive for? Physically, says Rand, all actions are generated by an organism toward the maintenance of its life, no matter how simplistic or complicated that organism may be. Thus, it is the organism's ultimate end, its life, against which all other values are judged, its ultimate value. To Rand, quote, "That which furthers its life is the good, that which threatens its life is the evil," unquote. It is this ultimate value, the value of life, that makes all other values possible, for, quote, "Without an ultimate goal or end, there can be no lesser goals or means," unquote. Plants can survive based only on, quote, "automatic physical functions," unquote, whereas animals must engage consciously with the world to obtain their fuel for survival. The way in which man differs, and is thus the highest of all creatures, is that man has no automatic knowledge of good and evil, but instead must come to realize them through conceptual knowledge, as mediated by reason. It is reason, then, that is man's basic means of survival, and not simply consciousness. The key differentiating aspect of reason is that it is volitional and fallible. Man's mere sensations are not enough to guide his survival, and he must engage in reason so as to provide for his needs. Quote, "No percepts and no instincts will tell him how to light a fire, how to weave cloth, how to forge tools, how to make a wheel, how to make an airplane, how to perform an appendectomy, how to produce an electric light bulb or an electric tube or a cyclotron or a box of matches. Yet his life depends on such knowledge, and only a volitional act of his consciousness, a process of thought, can provide it," unquote. The means of his survival cannot be arbitrary, as they are dictated by nature. What is up to choice, however, is the values that man pursues, and while man may choose the wrong values, he is, quote, "not free to succeed with it," unquote. The question, then, of ethics is what values ought man have which are conducive to his survival? This is where a common misunderstanding occurs, as incurious readers interpret Rand as saying that man ought to pursue mere existence at any cost. While it would make Rand's arguments much easier to respond to, this is not what she actually believes. She believes that the standard of value is not mere existence. Quote, "It does not mean the momentary physical survival of a crawling aggregate of muscle who is willing to accept any terms for the sake of what is known as survival at any price. Man's survival qua man means the terms, methods, conditions, and goals required for the survival of a rational being through the whole of his lifespan, in all those aspects of existence which are open to his choice." Close quote. Of course, then, the question becomes what goals are befitting of the rational mind. Rand argues that the purpose of man's life is productive work in the service of living for one's own sake. To live for one's own sake, says Rand, is to make the achievement of one's own happiness his, quote, highest moral purpose, unquote. In a sense, then, the standard of what it means for one to be surviving qua man is for them to pursue their happiness above all else. This, to Ayn Rand, is the, quote, purpose of ethics, unquote. And finally, my friends, we have reached the point where I will object. Up to this point, I've ignored a myriad of critiques that I could have made of Rand's philosophy. While all would be seriously damning, they are not the kind of thing that one is likely to notice. Here, however, I think even a layperson can see the seeming contradiction in where I've stopped. Specifically, the contradiction between Rand's professed love of reason and her assertion that living for one's own sake, i.e., one's own happiness, is the highest moral virtue. While there may be some exceptions, I think most would find this assertion completely ludicrous. Think about all the people in the world who seem happy despite them being morally depraved, not just by your standard, but also by the standards that Rand sets up. If Rand is right, that the pursuit of one's happiness is the highest moral purpose, then how can she fault dictators, oppressors, thieves, and murderers, who have prospered and, by all accounts, lived happy lives? Rand does have an answer to this, but it is this answer which makes her concept of happiness broken at a fundamental level. To justify herself, she quotes from John Galt, who, it must be said, is a fictional character in a book that she wrote. Quote, happiness is a state of non-contradictory joy, a joy without penalty or guilt, a joy that does not clash with any of your values and does not work for your own destruction. Happiness is possible only to a rational man, the man who desires nothing but rational goals, seeks nothing but rational values, and finds his joy in nothing but rational actions, unquote. In other words, Rand sidesteps the problem entirely by simply redefining happiness as something else. What raiders, thieves, and exploiters feel is not real happiness. No true state of happiness can be achieved through the values that are improper to man. No true state of happiness puts sugar on his porridge. Rand's attempt to salvage this is lengthy and hard to parse. Boiled down, there are two real responses that Rand gives, both of which commit her to an even greater sin than a no true Scotsman. One response she gives is that, quote, happiness can properly be the purpose of ethics, but not the standard, unquote, which she uses to distinguish herself from hedonism. She does say a lot of stuff after this, but this explication fails to get off the ground because it's straightforwardly contradictory to the foundational presuppositions that Rand makes. Recall earlier one of her central claims, quote, without an ultimate goal or end, there can be no lesser goals or means, unquote. Under her own definition of terms, it makes no sense to say that something can be the purpose of ethics, i.e. the goal of ethics, but not the standard of ethics, as she already defined the ultimate goal as being the standard against which all other values are judged. This response, then, is a non-starter. The other response she has available is to essentially double down on there being a significant difference between joy that's, quote, free of contradiction and joy that isn't. She does give it her best effort to try and explain what the problem is. Quote, the maintenance of life and the pursuit of happiness are not two separate issues. To hold one's own life as one's ultimate value and one's own happiness as one's highest purpose are two aspects of the same achievement. Existentially, the activity of pursuing rational goals is the activity of maintaining one's life. Psychologically, its result, reward, and concomitant is an emotional state of happiness. It is by experiencing happiness that one lives one's life. And when one experiences the kind of pure happiness that is an end in itself, the kind that makes one think, this is worth living for, what one is greeting and affirming in emotional terms is the metaphysical fact that life is an end in itself, unquote. In her estimation, then, there is an inherent problem in happiness insofar as it contradicts, quote, rational goals, unquote. Indeed, they cannot be separated. As a general point, the idea that sticking to one's values will lead to greater happiness than short-term compromises is nothing new. However, with Rand specifically, there is a huge problem. If happiness is, quote, non-contradictory joy, unquote, then the obvious question is, contradictory to what? Of course, the answer to this question for Rand is the, quote, rational ethic, unquote. But consider exactly how it is that the rational ethic is justified by Rand. Yes, she justifies her ethic as rational because it leads to the pursuit of happiness as an end in itself. In fact, as the, quote, highest moral purpose, unquote. The joy you might feel from pursuing other values is not truly happiness, because it can only be true happiness if it comes from the right values, and we know that those are the right values because they promote your true happiness. If you can't see it already, this is circular. Because Rand has no developed concept of happiness, she is forced to appeal to the values a sense of happiness comes from to make it distinct from other kinds of happiness. However, it was the pursuit of happiness upon which those values were justified in the first place. In true capitalist fashion, Ayn Rand has attempted to make an argument that pulls itself up by its own bootstraps. In doing so, however, just like in the real world, the actual result is its nose on the concrete.